Okay. So the endocrine system, and I did forget to get you guys a sign-in sheet. What's tomorrow? Tuesday. The what? The 14th. Is that a good day or average day? Not so good a day? Some people like the day. In college, me and my friends called it Black Friday. I mean, whatever day it was, like Black Tuesday or Black Wednesday. But it's a good day too. Valentine's. Just remember, guys, that it was created by the greeting card companies. Okay, so, But, okay, I do have to tell you one thing before we get started. This is the anniversary of my engagement today. Yeah. Today. My husband did not want to do it on Valentine's Day because that was too cliche. So do it the day before. So, anyways, he proposed to me a year ago today. Now let's learn about the endocrine system. I know, that's a great transition. All right, so general characteristics. Yes, we need to know all of this stuff, okay? So, we did go over these. Oh, I need a brighter color than yellow. How about purple? There we go. We did go over the major organs and structures of the endocrine system in lab. Same stuff. Same structures, same organs, nothing new with that, okay? And so these endocrine glands or organs secrete hormones. These are chemicals, okay? And one of the key things is that these hormones travel in the circulatory system, okay? So they travel in the bloodstream. Maybe I can write, my writing's getting a little better. So that is one of the characteristics of a hormone. It travels in the circulatory system, okay? So endocrine means inside, so within the bloodstream. So characteristics, we got 4 of those. So hormones are made in very small quantities. You do not need a lot of hormones of a particular kind to get the job done, okay? So very small quantities. It's secreted. So intercellular, so outside of the cell, in between the cells, then it is transported in the circulatory system in the blood until it reaches its target tissue. And so hormones are very specific. There are specific receptors on a particular type of target tissue that it bonds to. So each one has a very specific shape. It's that receptor molecule complex. So hormones are very, very, very specific. Okay? So this is a general statement here that hormones regulate the activities of the body. Which is true, because by the end of this chapter, you'll probably be super sick of hormones, but they do regulate and basically control all of the things that are happening in our body at any particular time. They're very important. Okay, so we're going to talk about a little bit of a comparison between the endocrine system and the nervous system. And there are similarities and differences. So first of all, remembering that endocrine means inside, so inside the bloodstream. And so how are signals controlled? How often is a hormone being released, for example? And so right here it says amount of hormone determines the signal of the strength. So a little bit of hormone, you'll get a little response. A moderate amount, moderate response. If you're releasing a ton of hormones, you're going to get a huge response, okay? So when we've talked about muscle contraction and neurons sending signals, we've always talked about the all or none principle. It either happens or it doesn't. That's different here with hormones, okay? So even if a small amount is released, you'll have a small effect. So it's definitely based on the quantity of hormone that's released will give you the magnitude of the response, okay? And notice, hormones start working within minutes, very quick. And so this box here is illustrating so hormone concentration in blood, time, shows you basically kind of what I was saying, representing it in a graph, that a weak signal, you will get a small amount of hormone released, you'll get a weak signal. More released, a stronger signal. A large amount, a large response. Okay? But when we talk about, let's do nervous system in a different color, because that's fun. Okay, so nervous system is what we've just kind of finally got finished through doing some nervous system stuff. It is what we would call frequency modulated. So how many times a signal is sent determines the strength of the signal. Do you guys remember that? Okay, and so the frequency of action potentials, how many are happening at any period of time, determines the strength of the response to that neuron. Okay? Notice the onset is very, 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 very quick, so within milliseconds. So if we want an extremely quick response, the nervous system was probably going to be responsible for that. Thank you. Whereas hormones just going to take a little bit longer, but they do work together, the nervous system and the endocrine system. And so, as it says, yeah, they're inseparable. The nervous system secretes what we would call neurohormones, okay? And specifically, neurohormones released from the posterior pituitary. We'll talk about those soon. Okay? So, the endocrine system and the nervous system are very closely related. They're intertwined, interconnected, so they're not completely separate, but they do have their own strengths and weaknesses. Okay. Categories of chemical signals. You will need to know these terms. Okay. So we're just going to go through these terms, get familiar with them, remembering. Okay, a hormone. It's a chemical signal. It's released into the bloodstream, and it affects distant cells, okay? So it travels in the circulatory system until it reaches its target tissue, and it could be very far away from where that hormone was released. So the example that's given here is estrogen. Other hormones, let's say oxytocin. Well, oxytocin is released from your anterior pituitary, and it travels all the way down to the uterus to help with uterine contractions. That's affecting a tissue, a different type of tissue, in a very different part of the body. Okay? But we need to remember that hormones are specific. So they only fit in that particular type of receptor. Okay, what does autocrine mean? So it's released by cells, so it's a chemical signal. It's released by cells, and it has a local effect on the same type of cells. Okay? So it would be like one epithelial cell releasing a substance that affects all the other epithelial cells right around it. So it's a localized effect of the same cell type. So auto refers to self. Okay, so autocrine. Paracrine, on the other hand, so we got our para. This is released by cells that affect other different types of cells, still locally. Okay, so autocrine is local, so is paracrine, but so autocrine affects the same type of cell, and paracrine affects different type of cell. Okay. Oh, is that a, looks like an A. All right. Pheromones. These hormones are released into the environment, and what does it say? Is thought to have an effect on our behavior and our body physiology. So, for example, some animals will release pheromones and it attracts the opposite sex. I think at this point we've proven that humans also release pheromones, which the fragrance industry totally capitalizes on. So they include pheromones in their perfumes to help try to attract the opposite sex when they wear a certain perfume. Not kidding. Whether or not it actually works, who knows? I think humans are more complex than an insect that's releasing pheromones. But we do release pheromones, which is interesting. Kind of gives us away a little bit if we like someone, if they're picking up on the pheromones you're releasing. Okay, neurohormone. So neurohormones are hormones that are produced by the nervous system. And so neurohormones we just talked about on the previous slide, and it's the same example that I typed here on the next slide. So they're produced by the nervous system, they act like hormones, and hormones travel in the bloodstream. They affect tissue types and organs in different parts of the body and different tissue types. So a neurohormone fits into that category. Okay. Then we have two others, either a neuromodulator or a neurotransmitter. And these guys also travel just a short distance, and it's secreted into extracellular spaces, so outside the cell, and it's going to influence postsynaptic cells. Okay, so one really good example is acetylcholine. Do you guys remember acetylcholine? Where do we find acetylcholine? The synapse between what kind of cells? Muscle and neuron. Yeah. And so this neurotransmitter is released by the neuron. It travels a short distance, so across that synaptic cleft, and then binds to receptors on the muscle side. The muscle's plasma membrane. And so these neurohormones, acetylcholine is technically a neurohormone because it's released by nerves. Okay? Travels short distance because we have our synapse. Oh, I want to write synapse. No. Could we just? Okay. So our synapse. And remember we talked about modulators? We won't talk a lot about modulators in this chapter, neuromodulators that can, like IPSBs and EPSBs, EPSBs can excite or speed up a reaction, and IPSBs can inhibit a reaction. So those are examples of neuromodulators. Okay, how do we control how much hormone is secreted at any particular time? Well, most things in the body are controlled by negative feedback. So, bam, so are most hormones. Most hormones are controlled by negative feedback, which are basically, they're designed to bring the body back to homeostasis, bring your body back to normal. So most hormones are released when something's off a little bit, like maybe you don't have enough water, and so it's going to release ADH, your antidiuretic hormone, to help you save water. Okay? And that would bring you back to normal, and it would stop releasing that hormone once your water balance is proper in your body. So, note, says most hormones are not secreted at a constant rate. Okay? Most of them are not. There are a few that are, but most are only secreted, are only secreted when they're needed. That rhymed. Okay. So they are regulated by 3 different methods. So action of a substance other than a hormone on an endocrine gland. And we'll talk about each of these. Okay, so this is just kind of giving the list. So Negative feedback. One of the ways hormones are controlled is by other substances that aren't hormones. Okay? How they affect an endocrine gland. Secondly, neural control. So the nervous system can control the endocrine gland. So for example, the adrenal glands have neuronal control. So that could affect what's being released from the adrenal gland. Control of the secretory, so how much is being secreted. So controlling the secretory I'm just going to read this. Control of secretory activity of one endocrine gland by hormone or neurohormone secreted by another endocrine gland. That's not confusing. So basically it's saying the activity of one hormone or gland is affected by another hormone or gland's activity. Okay? So we'll definitely talk about these. So the very first one was action of a substance other than a hormone. Okay? So what looks like we're going to be comparing, we're going to be looking at how a substance that's not a hormone affects bodily function. So the example we're using here is the balance of glucose and insulin in our bloodstream. Okay? Our pancreas makes both of those hormones, and they both have an important effect on your blood sugar regulation. So for example, if you just ate a nice yummy donut or 2 or 3, you're going to have a lot of sugar in your bloodstream. Yay, sugar! Well, we need to find a way, or your body needs to find a way to regulate how much sugar is in your bloodstream. You don't want to keep the sugar levels high. You want to pull them in to the cells so they can be used for energy, to make energy, or store it for later in the form of fat. And so we have 2 hormones that help with the regulation. Okay, so I think this is supposed to say as. So as your blood glucose concentration increases, so as you are getting more glucose or sugar in your blood, you're going to have insulin being secreted from the pancreas. Insulin basically causes cells in your body to take in that sugar, to take in the glucose, so it is no longer in your bloodstream. That's how it physically is able to decrease your blood glucose levels, because insulin tells cells in your body to take it in. Okay? Now, so insulin tells glucose to be taken up by tissue. So make sure you remember the exact effect that insulin has on sugar in the bloodstream. So when insulin's released, what does it do? Okay? And so if the tissues are taking up this glucose and using it for cellular respiration, that's going to decrease the amount of blood glucose, or decrease the amount of glucose that's in your blood, and it will stop secreting insulin when it reaches a nice solid set point, like back to normal. Also, the autonomic nervous system can affect this as well. So this, if we go back to the title of this, action of a substance other than a hormone. Insulin is a hormone, glucose is not. Okay? So insulin affects another substance, glucose, that is not a hormone. And so what it can do, you use it for energy, or as I mentioned, if you're not going to use it right away, you can store it in your fat deposits. Okay, second one, nervous system regulation. So we know there's definitely a component involved with hormones and the nervous system. We have our neurohormones. Pardon me. I'm sorry for yawning. Good old vitamin C. Help. Okay. Nervous system regulation. So, remember the sympathetic division, guys? we have the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And they kind of, one's responsible for a major kind of activity, and one's responsible for a different major activity in your body. Do you remember? They regulate different systems, different actions in your body. Yes, fight or flight. Which one would that go with? Sympathetic nervous system. Right. So the sympathetic nervous system is typically what we'd call the fight or flight response. So preparing your body for action. Okay. The other one, parasympathetic, a great way to remember that is rest and digest. Okay. Good ways to remember. So sympathetic division, fight or flight. And so it's going to be releasing very important hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So both of these are being released from the adrenal medulla. Okay, so epinephrine is basically what people call adrenaline, gives you that almost superhuman strength or ability. It makes your heart beat faster, makes your breathing rate increase. So you're increasing the amount of oxygen, you're pumping blood faster. So it's basically, yes, for survival. Okay. So that's the epinephrine effect. And we've talked about norepinephrine before, about how that's kind of our body's natural painkiller. It blocks the signals of pain from going to the central nervous system. Did I release that? Yeah. So it blocks that signal, so you're not feeling pain when you're in this stressful life or death possibly situation. So the pain won't slow you down and when you're in survival mode, okay? But norepinephrine's been used a lot in medications nowadays for people who do have chronic pain situations. So increasing the amount of that neurohormone in a person's body can help influence the amount of pain they're feeling or perceiving. So then we have negative feedback control. So nervous system, we've learned this before, but it's a good thing to remember is that almost everything in your body, almost everything is regulated by negative feedback, okay? Very few things are regulated by positive feedback. So a good example, childbirth is positive feedback, the labor and childbirth. There was another one that was really good and I forgot. So we'll stick with childbirth for now. Okay, so nervous system regulation, know the basics of that. And then number 3, hormonal regulation. Here is a different example of positive feedback. Okay, positive feedback. We don't have this happening very often. Oh, and in whose body is it happening in? Females. Yeah, we are the lucky ones. We seem to be getting most of the positive feedback situations. Okay, so this is referring to the the monthly cycle a female goes through of an egg maturing, an egg ovulating, being released, her body preparing for pregnancy, and if she does not become pregnant, then that uterine lining she was building up is sloughed off during what we call a period or ant flow or whatever you want to call it. And then it starts all over again, preparing her body for pregnancy again. Happens every blessed month. But just remember, ladies, this allows you someday to be a mom. Even though now it seems like a curse. Maybe. Maybe you like it. I don't know. Anyways, back to hormones. Okay. So, before ovulation. So, ovulation, quick definition. This is when the egg has matured in the ovary and it is ripe and ready for fertilization. And so when it's ready to go, it bursts free from the ovary, and then it starts its 7-day journey down the oviduct, so her uterine tube, down to her uterus. Okay, so estrogen and so small amounts of estrogen is released from the ovary. So your ovary is an endocrine structure, endocrine gland. And so that will be releasing estrogen, and then estrogen has an effect. So estrogen stimulates what's called the gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That hormone is found and released from the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, if you remember, I said it was like the master control of the body. It even is when it comes to hormones. It basically sends what we would call releasing hormones. And so if you remember, we have the hypothalamus, and then right below it attached is the pituitary gland, right? So we have this little infundibulum, hypothalamus, infundibulum, pituitary gland. The hypothalamus sends a little hormone down just a tiny bit to the pituitary gland. We call them releasing hormones. And the releasing hormone tells the pituitary gland to release a specific hormone. It's kind of silly. So, for example, estrogen, when it is created or released by the ovary, is going to stimulate our hypothalamus up here. Okay, it's going to stimulate it to release what we call gonadotropin releasing hormone, and that acts on our why does that say anterior? It should be. Okay, anyways, it acts on the anterior pituitary. So gonadotropin releasing hormone tells your anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone. Okay? The female system is complex. So luteinizing hormone then travels down to the ovary. Okay, different target tissue in a different part of the body. These are hormones. And the ovary, in the presence of the luteinizing hormone, look at this, causes even more estrogen to be released. More estrogen is released. It goes back to the hypothalamus and sends a signal back to the anterior pituitary, which causes even more gonadotropin releasing hormone to be released, which causes even more luteinizing hormone to release. So it's building on itself. So the more estrogen that's released, it triggers more luteinizing hormone, which triggers even more, until you basically reach this peak where the egg actually ovulates and bursts free. So that positive feedback cycle that leads up to ovulation is basically building up to the point where that egg is released. Okay, so on the other hand, let's look at how negative feedback can work in the same system. Okay, so after ovulation happens, so after the egg is broken free, then the ovary starts to secrete a different hormone. So before ovulation, it was secreting estrogen. Now, after ovulation, it is secreting progesterone. And that is still in response to the luteinizing hormone. So LH is the luteinizing, hormone. Okay, LH. And GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay? So, in the presence of progesterone, it's going to inhibit any more release of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So progesterone just says no. Oh, that looks terrible. Let me see if I can do this better. So progesterone inhibits any more gonadotropin releasing hormone, which means it is not going to stimulate that ovary to release any more estrogen because ovulation has already occurred. So, by inhibiting the gonadotropin releasing hormone, it causes a decrease in that hormone and therefore a decrease in luteinizing hormone as well. So, if we inhibit this, we are ultimately going to cause a decrease in our luteinizing hormone, and then we're back to normal. So, our gonadotropin releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone levels will decrease, because this is an example of negative feedback. Okay, so instead of it continuing the cycle around and around like in the previous slide, this one is negative feedback loop, which acts to bring the hormone levels back to normal. Okay, now hormones are regulated at different amounts throughout time. Some are released only in little spurts when it's necessary. Some are released at a fairly steady amount over time. Some are released only when you have a certain type of stimulus. So first we're going to look at the chronic hormone regulation. So a really good example would be a thyroid hormone, TH, or sometimes people call it TSH, is thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone is kept at a pretty steady, even amount throughout life. It only goes up and down just a little bit. Okay, so it's regulated very carefully. And this hormone, of course, you're going to be seeing this in your bloodstream. Acute hormone regulation. So by the way, you need to know these three examples, what they mean. Okay, so acute hormone regulation. Usually when you hear the word acute, I think of someone being in a lot of pain or someone just got injured. Acute usually means like right away kind of a situation. So a good example would be epinephrine that's released in response to a stress event. That is going to be released at that exact time, and it doesn't last long at all. So it's very short-lived. Okay, and so you can see from this picture here, when you have a stimulus, you get a nice strong peak of hormone, but then it drops off really quick. Okay, that's a really good example of acute. And then you have another stimulus, and it peaks and drops again really quick. Okay, then we have cyclic, which is more like the female reproductive system, where hormones are regulated on a predictable or fairly predictable cycle. So for most women, the average cycle is about 28 days. It can vary a little higher, a little lower, or it can just be a mess. Yeah. So cyclic is there's some sort of predictability to the regulation of it. Okay? How are hormones transported? How are they distributed? Well, we know that hormones are transported in the bloodstream. It's one of the important definitions of being in the endocrine system, is that it has to travel in the bloodstream. So, but how do they get into the cells? Because the hormones have to either bind to receptors on the outside of cells, or they'll actually pass into the cell and bind to receptors inside. So let's look. Lipid-soluble hormones, these have the ability to just diffuse right through the walls of the capillaries. And so if we remember, capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelial cells that are really thin. I'm trying to draw a capillary wall. I know my artistic abilities are. So here's your capillary wall. So if it's a lipid, it diffuses out really easy. It passes right through. That's because our plasma membrane is made up mostly of what? Phospholipids, right. And that's the center core of that plasma membrane. And so that allows those lipid-soluble hormones to pass right through the center. However, if it's water-soluble, it's going to be repelled from the plasma membrane of a cell wall. It's not going to be able to pass through unless there are basically pores or little holes in the capillary walls that we call fenestrae. And I do have a picture of that coming up. So there's like these little leak channels almost where fluid passes through into the extracellular tissue, and hormones that can't pass through the walls of capillaries can pass through those holes. So big reminder here, hormones are distributed quickly because they circulate in the bloodstream. So we've talked about blood pressure before. We know our arterial system, there's a good amount of pressure there because it has to pump blood to our entire body. That's why we have thick, tough, strong arteries. That's to withstand the pressure. And so with that much pressure in the arterial system, you're able to get blood to travel throughout your body really quickly. Okay? Okay. All right, a half-life. So this is talking about how long a hormone is going to last in your system. Okay? And so we use the term half-life to help describe this. So a half-life is how much time it takes for half of a dose to be taken out of the circulatory system. So we could say half of the amount of hormone released by a particular gland, or you could even use, say, the half-life of Tylenol is 2 hours or something. Okay, so it's how much time does it take for half of that product to be taken up and out of the blood? That's all it wants to know. So hormones that have a long half-life, which means they are staying in the system longer, they are not breaking down very fast, so they're not being taken up by cells very quickly. So these long half-life hormones are regulating things that are supposed to be at a constant rate. Usually these are going to be lipid-soluble, and they will travel, as it says, through the plasma, and they actually will travel attached to other molecules, other proteins. So I would have, if I had to guess what would be a good hormone that would have a long half-life, I would back up a slide and say, well, no, I'll back up 2 slides. If it is going to be at a fairly constant rate, that sounds like chronic to me. So I would think a good example of a hormone with a long half-life might just be the thyroid hormone, because that's regulated at a consistent level all the time. And as it says, it's usually lipid-soluble. Things that have a short half-life are going to be used up or taken up rather quickly. Okay? So, and another thing about these is they have a very rapid onset, so that the effect starts really quick, but it doesn't last very long. So epinephrine is a really good example. These are typically water soluble. Okay? So typically those that have long half-lives are usually lipid soluble. Those that have short half-lives that don't last very long at all are typically water soluble. Okay? So you make sure you have this connection here. Okay? So how do hormones interact with other tissues? There's a lot of receptor talk in this chapter. But then we will start talking about individual hormones and where they're made and what they do, all that fun stuff. Okay, so but first, how do hormones interact with other tissues? Okay, so first of all, a binding site, this is where a hormone would bind to a receptor. And this is like the whole puzzle piece thing that we've talked about before. If we look at these 3 hormones here, and then our receptor site, which one's going to fit in that picture? It's our yellow one. It gives us this nice puzzle piece fit right here. The other ones would not fit properly. Okay? So the molecule, so if we're talking about this molecule here, it is a receptor. And the molecule that binds to it's a hormone, and the other word we use for hormone or a molecule that binds to a receptor is a ligand. And I know we've used that word before, so I wanted to bring that up again. So if a molecule is a receptor, the place where the hormone binds, this spot right here, that's your receptor site. And I know I've said this a bajillion times, but the hormone and the receptor site is very specific. Only one type of hormone will bind to a specific type of receptor site. So the example given here says epinephrine can't bind to receptor sites for insulin. Okay, it only can bind to receptor sites for epinephrine. So what's the point of all of this? So the purpose of binding to a receptor that's part of a target tissue is to get that particular type of cell to respond. Okay. So there are different ways you can regulate the effects of hormones. And downregulation and upregulation are two ways that we can regulate the response of a hormone in the body. Okay? So, and this is specifically talking about receptors. So the amount of receptors available for a particular hormone really determines how well that hormone is actually going to function in your body. So let's say so this picture here is giving an example of downregulation. So first of all, typically receptors are recycled. They're taken in, they're broken down, they're put back out. And how many receptors are available determines how many molecules would be taken in or how many signals it will receive. So if you want to reduce the effect of a particular hormone that binds to a receptor, you undergo a process that's called downregulation, where it basically pulls in some of those receptors inside the cell. So there's less receptors available. Okay? And so that is an example of downregulation, where you remove the receptors so you have less of an effect by that hormone. Okay, but note that tissues that are maintained at a constant rate, like chronically, are not going to be downregulated very well. So it's the ones that are short-lived or are responding to a stimulus that you have the ability to downregulate by taking away receptors. You are diminishing the effect of that hormone. Upregulation is the exact opposite. And so this basically causes an increase in receptors. So this is our first one right here, and this is the third step, where we have a ton more receptors available. Okay? The more receptors available, if you have hormones that bind to them, that means you're going to have a stronger response. It's going to be more sensitive to a particular hormone. Okay, so upregulation, here's an important point, increases the sensitivity of that hormone. So an example here is if the follicle stimulating hormone, so FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Let's see, follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so if you're increasing the amount of receptors, then you end up with the cells in the ovary being more sensitive to it. And when they're more sensitive to it, it can cause ovulation. So this is just an example, but in general, you should know what upregulation does. You're putting out more receptors to have a more sensitive response. Or downregulation, you're taking away receptors to decrease the sensitivity of the tissue to that particular hormone. Okay? Aren't you glad this is being recorded right now? Yeah. It's a fun chapter. It gets funner. And that's totally a word. Okay. Membrane-bound receptors. So this is where I hinted that there were receptors on the membrane, some are on the inside. So this is where we're talking about receptors that are part of the membrane. Okay? So we know about our receptors already. We know that there's a binding site, a receptor site. So this one is here. Looks like the same one we saw on the previous slide. So that's that binding site right there, or the receptor site. So you would need a receptor for a hormone that cannot pass through. If it can't pass through the plasma membrane, it's going to need a receptor. So water-soluble hormones are not going to be able to pass through that plasma membrane. So those are going to be more likely and are going to need a receptor for them to have an action on the cell. Okay, so Here it is. Hormones that need a receptor on the plasma membrane, water-soluble, or large proteins or large hormones that are too big to pass through the plasma membrane. And some of the examples are like glycoproteins, polypeptides. I'm not too worried about that. Smaller molecules, epinephrine and norepinephrine, those are water-soluble. So they do need to have to bind to a receptor on the plasma membrane, okay? And so when the hormone attaches to that receptor, it causes changes inside the cell, okay? And Wednesday, we'll talk about how that next step occurs, okay? And that is all for today. Thank you.